She had thought of everything: the staged crime scene, the tearful 911 call, the perfect alibi. But there was one thing Darlene Gentry didn't count on: a pond, a realtor who paid attention, and a video camera hidden in the bushes that would capture her returning to the scene to retrieve what she thought she'd gotten away with. On the morning of November 9th, 2005, just after 6 in the morning, a frantic 911 call came into the Robinson, Texas Police Department. The caller was a 31-year-old nurse named Darlene Gentry, and her voice was panicked as she told the operator what she'd found. The recording of that call captures her saying she got up that morning and discovered her back door was open, her husband's guns were missing, and Keith was in distress. He wasn't responding normally. When officers arrived within 3 minutes of the call, they found Darlene still on the phone with the 911 operator. Inside the master bedroom, they discovered 31-year-old Keith Gentry unconscious in bed. He had been shot in the head. He was still alive, barely. The ambulance rushed him to the hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save him. But the injury was too severe. Keith was declared brain dead and passed away later that same day. And almost immediately, the police knew something wasn't right about Darlene's story. To understand how this case unfolded, you need to know who Darlene and Keith Gentry were. Born on September 2, 1974, in Waco, Texas, Darlene grew up in Cameron, a small town between Austin and Waco with a population under 6,000. She was homecoming queen, on the flag corps, and had a personality that drew people to her. With her long blonde hair and vivacious personality, friends said she was the picture of a Texas beauty queen. She could have had any man she wanted. After high school, she went to Texas State Technical College to study dental assisting. That's where she met Keith Gentry, who was studying drafting and welding. Darlene later told the television show Snapped that her first impression was his eyes. She said he just had the most beautiful eyes, and she was immediately interested. They bonded over their love of beer, dancing, and deer hunting. Keith was outgoing with rugged good looks, and friends said Darlene acted like Keith hung the moon. Whatever he wanted to do, they did together. After graduating in 1997, Darlene wanted to settle down, but Keith wasn't ready yet. She moved to Dallas and worked for a dentist, but after her car was stolen, she decided to move back home. Keith didn't want to lose her again. He proposed in 1999, and they got married soon after in what Darlene described as a typical Texas wedding with barbecue and dancing. They moved next door to Keith's parents in Robinson, Texas, right outside of Waco. Darlene got a nursing degree, and Keith took a job as an engineer for an electric utility company. In just a few years, they had 3 boys almost back-to-back: Chase, Cody, and Cade. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family. But Keith's job kept him on the road half the week, and Darlene had her hands full with work and 3 young children. She relied heavily on Keith's parents, Wayman and Glenda Gentry, who lived right next door, to help with the kids. With Keith working long hours away from home, Darlene frequently left the kids with Keith's parents while she went out with friends. Keith's father later said they could see problems starting. The couple didn't seem happy, and Keith wasn't happy. Concerned about being away from his family so much, Keith quit his high-paying job so he could be home for the kids when Darlene was away. Even after landing a desk job to spend more time at home, their marriage continued to fall apart after 6 years together. But Keith told his family he was determined to make it work, no matter what. Darlene, it seems, had other plans. That November, morning in 2005 started like any other, at least according to Darlene's story. She told police she'd been asleep in the room their 3 sons shared since about 3:30 that morning because their youngest, only 18 months old, woke up and wouldn't go back to sleep alone. She claimed she put on a movie for the kids and eventually dozed off herself. The next thing she knew, she woke up around 6 in the morning. She said she went to check on Keith and found the back door standing open and the gun cabinet emptied. The guns from the cabinet were stacked in an orderly pile outside the back door. Then she found Keith in bed, barely breathing. The first officers arrived on the scene within 3 minutes of the 911 call, but it didn't take them long to notice that something was off. Really off. There were no signs of a break-in, no forced entry. The back door was open, but it hadn't been kicked in or damaged. The guns from the cabinet were carefully stacked outside. If someone had broken in to steal guns, why would they stack them so neatly? Why wouldn't they just take them? And if this was a burglary gone wrong, why was nothing else disturbed? Why wasn't the house ransacked? Why was only Keith targeted? More importantly, there was another detail that bothered investigators. Darlene was a trained nurse. She worked in healthcare. She knew how to respond to medical emergencies. But when officers arrived, Keith was still in bed in critical condition. Darlene hadn't tried to stop any bleeding. She hadn't performed CPR. She hadn't moved him or tried to help him in any way. For a nurse to see her husband in that state and not attempt any kind of first aid struck investigators as extremely suspicious. An hour into her interview at the police station, authorities got word that Keith Gentry was brain dead. They drove Darlene to the hospital, where she signed the consent forms to take her husband off life support. He passed away soon after. Keith's father, Wayman Gentry, later said he never saw her actually break down. She had tears in her eyes and mourned, but not like someone in that situation should have. There was something missing in her reaction, something that didn't feel genuine. Darlene returned to the police station that afternoon to finish her interview. By then, detectives had decided she was their prime suspect. The crime scene just didn't make sense as a burglary. Detective Tracy O'Connor, who was leading the case, started asking harder questions. The holes in Darlene's story were becoming impossible to ignore. Darlene later said the detective point-blank told her he knew what was happening. She realized he was accusing her right there, so she said she needed an attorney. The interview stopped immediately, but the investigation continued. Later that day, Darlene gave consent to search her home. And that's when investigators found something critical. In the kitchen trash can, buried at the bottom, they discovered a pair of latex gloves. Inside one of the gloves was the casing of a .22 caliber bullet. The gloves were sent to the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab for analysis. When the results came back, they were damning. The lab recovered gunshot residue on the gloves. Even more importantly, they found DNA on those gloves. 2 DNA profiles. One belonged to Keith Gentry, the other belonged to Darlene. Investigators also discovered a motive, and it was a big one. Keith had 2 life insurance policies that totaled around $750,000. The couple was having financial problems. They were in debt, and Darlene stood to collect $750,000 if Keith passed away. On November 27, 2005, just 18 days after Keith's passing, police arrested Darlene on suspicion of his murder. Here's what makes this case even more remarkable and heartbreaking. Keith's parents rallied around Darlene after her arrest. They helped her raise her $50,000 bail, and she was out of jail by that same evening. Wayman Gentry, Keith's father, said they had 100% belief in her innocence. Keith's mother even told authorities they were looking in the wrong direction if they believed Darlene would have hurt Keith. Keith's family was so convinced of her innocence that they paid her bond and supported her fully as she worked to find a new home for her and her sons. They couldn't believe their daughter-in-law would hurt Keith. She moved in with them. They took care of her children. They stood by her side, defending her to anyone who questioned her innocence. And this is where Darlene made the mistake that would unravel everything. Just days after Keith passed away while she was out on bond, Darlene contacted a real estate agent named Robert Pavelka. She told him she wanted to buy a new house so she could make a fresh start for herself and her sons. She needed to get away from the house where Keith had passed away, she said. It was too painful to stay there. Pavelka showed her a property in the next town over near Axtell, Texas. The property had a pond next to it, and Darlene was excited about this feature. She said it would be perfect for the children to fish in, something she claimed Keith always wanted. He'd always dreamed of having a place where he could take the boys fishing, she told Pavelka. Pavelka didn't think much of it at the time. He figured she was just a grieving widow trying to find a way to move forward with her life. But then something strange happened. After her arrest, while she was still out on bond, Darlene called Pavelka again. She said she wanted to move forward with purchasing the house. But now, suddenly, she wanted the pond filled in. The very feature she'd been so excited about. The pond where she claimed her boys would learn to fish just like their father wanted. She now wanted it completely filled with dirt. The sudden change confused Pavelka. It didn't make sense. Why would she suddenly want to eliminate the very feature she'd been so enthusiastic about? Why would she want to destroy something she said her late husband had always dreamed of? The more Pavelka thought about it, the more suspicious it seemed. So he did what any concerned citizen would do. He called the police and told them about Darlene's strange request. Detectives immediately understood what might be happening. They suspected Darlene had disposed of the weapon in that pond. And now that she was under investigation, she was panicking. She wanted the pond filled in before anyone could search it. But she couldn't just go retrieve the weapon herself because she knew police were watching her. So she was trying to bury the evidence under tons of dirt instead. The police moved quickly. They called in the Texas Rangers, who brought a dive team to search the water. And listen to how fast this happened. Texas Ranger Steve Foster later told Snapped that probably 10 to 15 minutes after getting into the water, one of the divers found what they were looking for. It was Keith Gentry's missing .22 caliber revolver, the gun that had been taken from the cabinet that morning. The weapon had been in that pond all along, but the police didn't tell Darlene they'd found the gun. Instead, they set a trap. Police asked Pavelka to call Darlene and tell her that he would have to drain the pond before he could fill it in. They wanted to see how she would react to this news. Would she panic? Would she try to retrieve the gun before the pond was drained? Then they set up surveillance. Officers placed a large stick in the exact spot where they'd found the gun, marking the location. And they installed a video camera hidden in the brush near the pond, pointing directly at that spot. Then they waited to see if Darlene would take the bait, and she did exactly what they hoped she would do. If you're enjoying these deep dives into cases where killers thought they were smarter than everyone else, make sure you're subscribed to Accused. We bring you new true crime stories every week where we break down the psychology, the evidence, and the mistakes that brought justice. The video footage captured everything, and it's absolutely damning. It showed Darlene returning to the pond alone. She looked around carefully, checking to make sure no one would see her. Then she waded into the water, going deeper and deeper. But here's the thing that sealed her fate. She didn't search randomly around the pond. She didn't look in different areas trying to figure out where the gun might be. She went directly, and I mean directly, to the exact spot where the gun had been found. The marked spot. She knew precisely where it was supposed to be, because she's the one who put it there. The footage shows her searching that specific area for several minutes, her hands feeling around in the muddy water, becoming increasingly frustrated when she couldn't find what she was looking for. Eventually, she gave up and left, probably assuming the gun had somehow moved or sunk deeper into the mud. She had no idea that the Rangers had already pulled it from the water days earlier. She had no idea she'd been caught on camera, providing the prosecution with the most powerful piece of evidence they could have asked for. Darlene Gentry's trial for the murder of her husband began on February 6, 2007. Her defense team seemed confident about her chances for a full acquittal. With her good looks and Keith's family behind her, she presented well to a jury. And honestly, the prosecution's case seemed largely circumstantial. Sure, there were the gloves with the DNA and gunshot residue. Sure, there was the life insurance motive. But did they have absolute proof that Darlene was responsible? The defense was betting they didn't, but then the prosecution played that video. The courtroom went silent as jurors watched Darlene wade into that pond and go straight to where the weapon had been hidden. You could see it on their faces. This wasn't just circumstantial anymore. This was concrete evidence showing that Darlene knew exactly where that gun was because she had put it there. Keith's family, who still believed in Darlene's innocence, who had mortgaged their home to pay her bail, who had taken in her and her children, who had defended her against anyone who dared to suspect her, were forced to face reality as they watched that footage. You can only imagine what that moment was like for them. These were people who had lost their son, and now they were watching proof that the woman they'd defended, the mother of their grandchildren, was involved in what happened to him. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the jury how the crime scene had been staged to look like a burglary. They presented the latex gloves with gunshot residue and DNA from both Keith and Darlene. They talked about the $750,000 in life insurance that Darlene stood to collect. They brought in the realtor, Robert Pavelka, who testified about Darlene's suspicious behavior regarding the pond. They showed that the ballistics matched the gun found in the pond to what happened to Keith. And then, as their final blow, they played that video of Darlene searching for the weapon. The defense tried to argue that someone else could have been responsible for what happened to Keith. They attempted to introduce medical records suggesting Keith may have been involved with another couple and that marital issues could have given someone else a motive. But the judge ruled that evidence was too speculative and not relevant enough to be admitted. The defense also tried to cast doubt on the DNA evidence and suggested the investigation had been rushed and sloppy. But they couldn't explain away that video. It took the jury only 5 hours to convict Darlene of first-degree murder. Think about that. 5 hours to deliberate a case that had gone on for days. That's how powerful the evidence was, especially that footage of her at the pond. The next day, on February 7, 2007, Darlene was sentenced to 60 years in prison. After her conviction, Keith's parents won custody of Darlene's 3 sons. The boys, who were 9, 6, and 5 at the time of the sentencing, moved in permanently with their grandparents. In 2010, Darlene received a court order that prohibited her from having any sort of contact with her children. According to reports, the boys last saw their mother when Darlene's own mother took them to the prison without authorization during the first year of her incarceration. Since then, they've had no contact with her. Darlene didn't give up. She appealed her conviction, arguing that her rights had been violated when that incriminating video was produced and introduced at her trial. She claimed that because she'd been arrested before the video was made, her Sixth Amendment right to counsel had attached, and police shouldn't have been able to use the realtor to set up the sting operation without her attorney present. But the appeals court disagreed. They ruled that, because she hadn't been indicted yet when she spoke with Pavelka, her right to counsel hadn't attached. The conviction stood years later in 2010. Darlene filed an application for writ of habeas corpus, which is a legal document that alleges someone is being held illegally because of constitutional violations. She claimed she didn't get a fair trial because her trial attorneys were ineffective and because prosecutors had withheld favorable evidence. Specifically, she pointed to the latex gloves that had been found in her kitchen trash. Those gloves had gone missing before her trial, and there was a lot of finger-pointing about who had them last. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a hearing to look into these claims. In August 2010, after 2.5 days of testimony from witness after witness being questioned about the missing gloves, something surprising happened. Robinson Police Detective Mike Noel, who had testified 3 times during the hearing, called court officials about 4 p.m. on Wednesday to say he'd found the missing evidence. The pair of latex gloves had been sitting in a sealed envelope in the Robinson Police Department evidence room the entire time. They'd been misplaced, not hidden or destroyed. Darlene's attorneys tried to argue that if the gloves had been retested, they might have shown DNA from a third person, which could have broadened the field of suspects. They brought in a DNA consultant who testified there could have been indicators of another contributor. But prosecutors countered that even if that were true, it didn't change the mountain of other evidence against Darlene. The gloves still had her DNA and Keith's DNA. They still had gunshot residue. And most importantly, there was still that video of her at the pond. In 2016, the visiting judge hearing the case recommended that Darlene's request for a new trial be denied. He issued a 40-page order explaining that while mistakes may have been made, Darlene had received a fair trial, and the evidence supported her conviction. In November 2017, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals officially denied her request for a new trial and ruled that her murder conviction would stand. So what was the crucial mistake? Darlene actually made several. She staged a crime scene but did it poorly. The stacked guns outside, the lack of forced entry, the undisturbed house, it all indicated that this wasn't a real burglary. She kept evidence in her own trash. The latex gloves with the bullet casing were right there in her kitchen for police to find. She didn't even try to administer first aid to Keith, which immediately raised suspicions given her medical training. But the biggest mistake, the one that ultimately convicted her, was thinking she could outsmart the investigation by disposing of the weapon in that pond and then trying to cover her tracks by having it filled in. If she had just left that pond alone, if she hadn't contacted Robert Pavelka about buying that property, if she hadn't suddenly changed her mind about wanting the pond filled in, the police might never have found the gun. The pond could have kept that secret for years, maybe forever. But her attempt to be thorough, to tie up that one loose end, to erase the evidence, is exactly what gave her away. Her own actions led investigators directly to the evidence they needed. The realtor noticed her strange behavior and called police. The dive team found the gun in minutes, and the hidden camera caught her returning to the exact spot where she'd disposed of it. Every step she took to cover up what happened just created more evidence against her. The irony is brutal. If Darlene had just done nothing after disposing of the gun, she might have had a chance. The gloves in the trash were bad, but without the weapon, the case would have been much weaker. But she couldn't leave it alone. She had to try to eliminate every trace. And that decision destroyed her. This case shows us something important about criminal investigations. It's not just about finding evidence. It's about understanding human behavior. The investigators in this case knew that if Darlene had disposed of the weapon in that pond, She'd panic once she learned the pond might be drained. They understood that a guilty person would try to fix the problem. They understood that someone who had committed a serious crime would be desperate to make sure the evidence stayed hidden. And they were absolutely right. They used that understanding to set a trap, and Darlene walked right into it. She couldn't resist. The thought of that gun being discovered was too much for her to handle. So she went back, and in doing so, she handed the prosecution the smoking gun, both literally and figuratively. For Keith's family, the betrayal cut impossibly deep. They'd initially stood by Darlene, believing her claims of innocence. They'd mortgaged their home to pay her bail. They'd welcomed her into their home. They'd cared for her children. They'd defended her reputation. But as the truth emerged through that trial, their support turned to heartbreak and anger. They'd lost their son, and then they had to face the reality that the woman they'd defended, the mother of their grandchildren, was involved in what happened to him. Keith's father, Darlene Gentry, said that when the Court of Criminal Appeals denied Darlene's request for a new trial in 2017, it was a good day for them, but not for her. He and his wife are raising Keith's 3 sons, who are now young adults. They describe Keith as a loving father who quit his high-paying job to be home with his kids. He was a dedicated husband who tried to save his marriage. He was a loyal son who lived next door to his parents. And he lost his life in his own bed while he slept, by the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with. As for those 3 little boys, they lost both parents that day in November 2005. Their father lost his life, and their mother will spend decades in prison for being responsible. They were raised by their grandparents, who had to process their own grief while trying to protect 3 young children from the horrible truth about what happened to their father. According to court records, Darlene is currently serving her sentence at the Dr. Lane Murray unit in Gatesville, Texas. She still maintains her innocence regarding Keith's passing. She will be eligible for parole in February 2037 after serving 30 years. Her maximum sentence date extends to February 2067, when she'll be 92 years old. There's no such thing as a perfect crime. There never is, because every crime leaves traces, and every criminal makes mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are big and obvious. Sometimes they're small and subtle, but they're always there. Darlene Gentry thought she'd planned everything perfectly. She thought she could stage a burglary, collect the insurance money, and start a new life. She'd even found the perfect place to hide the weapon. But she couldn't account for observant investigators who knew the crime scene was staged. She couldn't account for a concerned realtor who found her behavior suspicious. She couldn't account for Texas Rangers who could search a pond and find a gun in 15 minutes. And most of all, she couldn't account for her own panic, her own need to control every detail, her own compulsion to go back and make absolutely sure that gun was gone. That compulsion is what put her in prison for 60 years. That compulsion is what took her children away. That compulsion is what turned Keith's family from her biggest supporters into witnesses against her. She went back to that pond because she couldn't help herself, because the uncertainty was eating at her, because she needed to know the evidence was still hidden. And in that moment, reaching into the muddy water of that pond, searching desperately for a gun that was already sitting in police evidence, Darlene Gentry sealed her own fate. The case of Darlene Gentry reminds us that justice often comes down to the smallest details and the biggest mistakes. A latex glove in the trash, a pond that someone wanted filled in, a video camera hidden in the bushes, a woman who couldn't resist going back one more time. These tiny pieces came together to reveal the truth about what happened to Keith Gentry on that November morning in 2005, and they ensured that the person responsible would face justice for taking his life. What do you think about this case? Could Darlene have gotten away with it if she'd just left that pond alone? Do you think there's any chance she's actually innocent like she claims? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more cases where killers thought they were smarter than the investigators tracking them down, subscribe to Accused. We dig deep into the evidence, the psychology, and the moments where everything fell apart. I'll see you in the next one.